My husband slid a manila folder across our VIP table the exact moment the ballroom erupted in applause for his new CEO title. His mother leaned over her crystal wine glass, laughing, as she told me to take the $50,000 and disappear. I did not cry. I picked up the gold pen and signed the divorce papers without a single flinch. He thought he had just discarded a worthless liability. He had no idea I was the invisible architect of his entire empire. Then my screen illuminated with a text from a father he thought was a deadbeat. "Do not leave, Dad is coming." And the grand oak doors of the ballroom violently burst open. The Ritz-Carlton Ballroom in downtown Atlanta hummed with the intoxicating energy of old money and newly acquired power. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 50 round tables draped in midnight blue silk. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated silently, pouring expensive champagne into the glasses of the city's most elite African-American power brokers. Politicians, real estate moguls, and socialites mingled their conversations, creating a low, sophisticated roar. At the center of it all stood the Vanguard Holdings executive table. I sat there in a tailored emerald green gown, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression carefully pleasant. I was playing my usual role. The quiet, supportive wife. The unremarkable woman lucky enough to marry into the prestigious Sterling family. Darius tapped his silver knife against his champagne flute. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the chatter. The room fell into a respectful silence as all eyes turned to my husband. Darius looked immaculate in his custom-tailored tuxedo. His confidence bordered on pure arrogance. He smiled that charismatic smile that had charmed wealthy investors and fooled me for an entire decade. He took the microphone. His voice echoed through the massive ballroom, smooth and practiced. He thanked the board of directors for their trust. He talked about leading Vanguard Holdings into a new era of unprecedented profit margins and aggressive expansion. The crowd clapped enthusiastically, but as the applause roared around us, Darius did not look at the audience. He looked down at me. His eyes were completely devoid of warmth. He stepped down from the podium and walked directly over to my seat. He reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. He tossed it onto my china dinner plate. The heavy folder landed with a dull thud right on top of my untouched steak. The people at our table, including his sister Chloe and her white husband Preston, stopped talking. The silence at our table was sudden and suffocating. I stared at the leather folder. I knew exactly what it was before I even opened it. Darius leaned in close. His expensive cologne washed over me, masking the absolute cruelty of his words. He spoke softly but clearly enough for his mother and sister to hear. "A new king needs a queen with the right pedigree, Savannah. You have been a bad investment, holding me back for way too long. I am restructuring my life starting tonight." I slowly opened the folder. Divorce papers. The bold black letters swam before my eyes for a fraction of a second before my analytical mind took over. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, sat directly across from me. She did not even try to hide her absolute delight. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that grated against my ears. She pushed a heavy gold pen across the table toward me. "Sign it, girl," Beatrice said, her voice laced with pure venom. 10 years ago, you walked into our Atlanta mansion with cheap shoes and a runaway father. We gave you a life you could never have dreamed of on your own. You should be down on your knees thanking us for our charity. Now you get to leave with a $50,000 settlement. You are incredibly lucky. We are so generous." Chloe chuckled, sipping her champagne. "Mom is right, Savannah. You never fit in with us. You always lack the proper refinement for our social circles." Preston, my brother-in-law, adjusted his silk tie and smiled his arrogant lawyer smile. He added his own legal threat, leaning across the expensive floral centerpiece to ensure I heard every single word. "I drafted those papers myself, Savannah. They are ironclad. You signed a prenuptial agreement when you had absolutely nothing. You leave with nothing. Do not make this difficult, or I will use my firm to tie you up in court until you cannot afford to buy groceries. The legal system works for people like me, not people like you. I suggest you take the money and walk out the back door before security escorts you out." They all looked at me, waiting for the breakdown. They expected me to sob. They expected me to beg Darius to reconsider our marriage. They expected me to cause a humiliating scene that would prove exactly why I did not belong in their elevated world. They wanted me to perform the role of the shattered, discarded wife. I looked down at the divorce papers. $50,000. $50,000 for 10 years of my youth. $50,000 for the countless nights I stayed awake fixing the disastrous financial models Darius could not comprehend. $50,000 for saving this very company from bankruptcy 3 separate times using my own anonymous shell accounts. $50,000 for building the very throne he was currently sitting on. I created him. I took a mediocre man with a recognizable last name and manufactured a corporate titan. I wrote his speeches. I structured his complex real estate deals. I managed his massive financial risks. I gave him everything. And now he was handing me $50,000 to disappear into the shadows. I picked up the gold pen. It felt heavy and cold between my fingers. I looked up at Darius. His arrogant smile wavered for a split second as he met my eyes. He was searching for devastation. He found absolutely nothing. I uncapped the pen. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I smoothed the thick paper with my left hand and signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, elegant strokes. I flipped to the next page and signed again. I made sure my signature was perfect. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. Darius stared at me, his brow furrowed in sudden confusion. My lack of emotion unnerved him completely. He had anticipated a massive fight. He had prepared for a hysterical wife screaming about betrayal and broken promises. He did not know how to process absolute total indifference. Keep the 50,000, Beatrice. I said, my voice perfectly calm and dangerously quiet. You are going to need every single penny to pay your moving expenses very soon. Beatrice scoffed, looking confused and deeply offended by my sudden confidence. She rolled her eyes and took another sip of her expensive champagne, muttering about my delusion. But Darius quickly recovered his typical arrogance. He grabbed the microphone again, turning his back on me to address the entire ballroom of wealthy guests. He smoothed his jacket and put his charming smile back on. Ladies and gentlemen, as Vanguard enters this glorious new chapter, I also enter a new chapter in my personal life. Behind every powerful man is a powerful woman who understands the tremendous weight of political legacy and generational wealth. He gestured dramatically toward the grand staircase at the back of the room. Please welcome the daughter of our esteemed state senator and my beautiful future Jasmine. The bright spotlight swung to the staircase. Jasmine walked down wearing a stunning crimson gown that clung to her curves perfectly. She smiled radiantly, playing the role of the perfect high society partner. The crowd murmured in surprise, but quickly transitioned into polite applause, recognizing the immense political weight of her family name. Chloe cheered loudly from our table, clapping her hands together enthusiastically. She looked at me with a smirk, waiting to see me break down. Beatrice beamed, looking at me with victorious malice, as if she had just won a war I did not even know we were fighting. She leaned over and whispered that a real woman knows how to elevate a man, while a fake woman only drags him down to the gutter. I sat perfectly still, watching the pathetic spectacle unfold before my eyes. They really thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded a nobody to make room for a political princess. They believed their own manufactured narrative of superiority and power. My phone vibrated against my thigh, hidden safely beneath the heavy silk tablecloth. I slipped it out of my emerald clutch. The screen illuminated brightly in the dim, ambient light of the ballroom. A single text message glowed from a blocked number I knew by heart. The message was short, but it carried the weight of a coming storm. Do not leave. Dad is coming. I locked my phone and placed it gently on the table next to my empty dinner plate. I took a slow sip of my water and shifted my gaze toward the entrance. Before Jasmine could even reach the bottom of the grand stairs, a deafening crash echoed through the luxurious venue. The classical music stopped abruptly, causing a wave of confusion among the guests. The massive 3-meter-high oak doors of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom were violently kicked open from the outside. The heavy wood slammed against the walls, making the expensive crystal chandeliers rattle ominously above our heads. The collective gasp of 200 elite guests filled the massive space as the conversation died instantly. Two massive private security guards in sharp black suits stepped into the room. They moved with military precision, standing on either side of the entrance. They scanned the shocked crowd with cold professional eyes, making sure no one moved a muscle. And then my father walked in, stepping directly into the brilliant light. He wore a custom-tailored suit and an expression that promised absolute ruin for anyone who stood in his way. The night of their greatest triumph was about to become the exact moment of their total destruction. He did not look like the runaway deadbeat they had spent a decade mocking at every family dinner. He did not look like a man who struggled to pay rent or a man who abandoned his daughter to the cruel mercies of the world. He moved with the terrifying grace of an apex predator entering a cage full of oblivious prey. His polished leather shoes clicked against the marble floor, echoing in the dead silence of the room. Every politician, every real estate developer, and every socialite parted, like the Red Sea, allowing him a clear path directly toward our table. Beatrice dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the floor, spilling expensive liquid over her designer shoes. Darius stood completely frozen at the podium, the microphone slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. Jasmine halted on the bottom step, her perfect smile dissolving into a mask of pure confusion. I remained seated, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my expression carefully neutral. I watched the blood drain entirely from my husband's face as he finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. The divorce papers sat on the table between us, no longer a symbol of my defeat, but the exact instrument of his impending doom. The game they thought they were playing had just ended. The real war was officially beginning right now. My father took another measured step forward, and the massive crowd parted for him as if he were royalty. He did not look like the man Beatrice had spent 10 years mocking. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that radiated quiet, unimaginable wealth. His presence commanded the massive ballroom, demanding absolute submission from every single person in attendance. Beatrice scrambled out of her chair, her face twisting into a mask of pure indignation and elitist rage. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at my father. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice cracking unpleasantly across the elegant space. "Throw this penniless thug out of my son's gala immediately. How did this street trash even get past the front lobby?" The two massive private security guards did not even flinch. They stood perfectly still beside the shattered oak doors, completely ignoring her frantic commands. Beatrice looked around wildly, expecting the hotel staff to rush forward and drag my father away. No one moved. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The state senator lowered his head, trying to distance himself from the impending disaster. Jasmine stood frozen on the staircase, looking like a frightened child who had wandered into the wrong play. My father ignored Beatrice entirely. He walked past our table without giving her a single glance. He stepped up onto the stage, moving with a calm, terrifying deliberation. Darius stepped back, his chest heaving with sudden panic. My father reached out and effortlessly took the microphone from my husband's trembling hand. Darius did not even try to hold on to it. He looked completely paralyzed by the sheer dominance of the man standing before him. "What is the meaning of this?" Darius finally managed to stammer, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and bruised ego. "You cannot just barge in here. This is a private corporate event. I am the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings." My father simply smiled, a cold, predatory smile that sent chills through the front row of the audience. He did not speak into the microphone yet. He just stood there, letting the crushing weight of his silence suffocate Darius. Darius turned his desperate eyes toward me. His panic quickly morphed into defensive rage. He pointed an accusatory finger in my direction, his face flushing dark with anger. "This is your doing!" he yelled, his voice echoing across the silent room. "You brought this deadbeat here to ruin my night because you are bitter. I dedicated a decade of my life to Vanguard. I built this company into an empire. And you bring your failure of a father here to humiliate me. You are nothing but a parasite, Savannah. You have been living off my salary and my success for 10 years. I placed my linen napkin on the table and slowly stood up. My emerald gown draped perfectly around me as I stepped away from the chair. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished marble floor sounded like the ticking of a countdown clock. I walked toward the edge of the stage, stopping just below where Darius stood. I looked up at the man I had spent 10 years building from scratch. He was pathetic. "Living off your success," I asked, my voice steady and carrying clearly without the need for a microphone. "Let us talk about your success, Darius. Let us talk about your coveted promotion to regional director 5 years ago. The promotion that put you on the path to becoming chief executive officer tonight." Darius swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the board of directors sitting at the front tables. "I earned that promotion," he said defensively. "I secured the South Bay project when everyone else said it was completely impossible." "You nearly went to federal prison for the South Bay project," I corrected him, my tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "You mismanaged the capital allocation so badly that the company was facing a $50 million deficit. You forged financial projections to cover your tracks. You were going to be indicted for corporate fraud. The only reason you were not arrested is because a ghost investor stepped in at the 11th hour and bailed out your failing project with a massive anonymous capital injection." The board members began whispering frantically among themselves. They remembered the South Bay miracle. It was the cornerstone of the Sterling family legacy. It was the exact reason Darius had been selected for the top job tonight. Everyone in the industry considered it his crowning achievement. Darius gripped the edge of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "That was a private equity firm," he insisted, his voice losing its confident timbre. "An anonymous angel investor believed in my vision. They saw the potential of the development and backed my leadership." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. There was no angel investor, Darius. There was no private equity firm miraculously discovering your terrible business plan. I was the ghost investor. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. Beatrice collapsed back into her chair, clutching her pearl necklace as she struggled to comprehend my words. Chloe shook her head, denying the truth even as it was laid bare before her. Preston narrowed his eyes, his legal mind racing to calculate the implications of my statement. "You are lying!" Darius shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You did not have $50 million. You were just a quiet wife organizing my charity dinners. You never understood high-level finance. You are just trying to embarrass me in front of my guests." "I understood enough to manufacture your entire career," I replied, looking him dead in the eye. "I used my own anonymous shell accounts to funnel the money into Vanguard. I rewrote the financial models you presented to the board. I drafted every single successful pitch you ever made. I fed you the strategies you claimed as your own brilliant insights. You did not build an empire, Darius. You simply stood on the podium I constructed for you. I kept you out of prison, and I put you in that tailored suit. And tonight you thought you could discard me with a $50,000 check and a ridiculous speech about finding a new queen." My father raised the microphone to his lips. His deep, resonant voice commanded absolute authority. He looked directly at the chairman of the Vanguard board of directors, who was sitting completely frozen in his seat. "My daughter has always been far too generous with her investments," my father said, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "She believed in building a family and elevating the people she loved. I, however, only believe in return on investment, and this particular asset has proven to be entirely toxic." My father reached inside his custom suit jacket. He pulled out a massive stack of heavily stamped legal documents. He stepped off the podium and walked directly to the board of directors table. He dropped the thick stack of papers right in the center of their expensive floral arrangement. The heavy thud of the documents hitting the table finalized the death of the Sterling dynasty. "Allow me to introduce myself properly," my father said, looking at the pale, terrified faces of the Vanguard executives. "My name is Elijah. I am the sole founder and primary shareholder of Apex Capital." The name dropped like a physical bomb in the room. Apex Capital was the most aggressive and feared private equity firm in the entire southeastern region of the country. They were known for ruthless acquisitions and dismantling corrupt corporate structures. The chairman of the board picked up the documents with shaking hands. His eyes scanned the first page and all the blood drained from his face. "As you will see in those buyout agreements." My father continued, his tone conversational but lethal. Apex Capital initiated a hostile takeover of Vanguard Holdings 48 hours ago. We spent the last 2 days aggressively acquiring every single outstanding share of your company from your largest institutional investors. We did it quietly. We did it legally. And we did it with absolute finality. Darius stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the stage. He looked like a man who had just been thrown out of an airplane without a parachute. He looked from the board members to my father and finally to me. His entire reality was disintegrating before his eyes. The wealth and power he thought he possessed were nothing but an illusion I had allowed him to maintain. "You cannot do this," Darius pleaded, his arrogance completely eradicated. "Vanguard belongs to my family. It is our legacy. I am the chief executive officer. You cannot just come in here and steal my company from me." My father turned to face Darius, a look of profound pity and disgust on his face. He adjusted his suit cuffs and offered a chilling smile. "You were the chief executive officer," my father corrected him. "As the new majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings, my very first executive action was to restructure the leadership team. Your position was officially terminated exactly 3 minutes ago." The silence that followed was absolute. No one dared to breathe. The golden child of the Sterling family, the man who had just publicly humiliated his wife to elevate his social status, had just been stripped of everything he owned in front of the entire city. I looked at the divorce papers still sitting on my dinner plate. The $50,000 settlement they tried to force upon me was nothing compared to the empire I had just ripped from their greedy hands. The phantom founder had finally stepped into the light, and the reign of the Sterling family was permanently over. Darius stood frozen on the stage, unable to process the magnitude of his sudden downfall. The microphone lay forgotten on the floor, emitting a low hum that underscored the tension in the room. Beatrice sat paralyzed at our table, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The reality of her sudden poverty was slowly crashing down upon her carefully constructed world. Chloe clutched her expensive purse, her eyes darting frantically toward her husband Preston, hoping his legal background could somehow reverse this nightmare. Preston, however, was already furiously typing on his phone, desperately trying to contact his law partners to verify the catastrophic claims my father had just made. I remained standing at the edge of the stage, allowing the undeniable truth of my power to wash over the room. I had spent 10 long years playing the role of the submissive, obedient wife, hiding my brilliance behind a veil of quiet compliance to appease their fragile egos. I had swallowed their constant insults and endured their endless condescension, all to preserve a marriage that Darius ultimately deemed disposable. He had mistaken my patience for weakness and my silence for ignorance. Now he was facing the severe consequences of his profound miscalculation. The board members at the front table began scrambling to collect their belongings, their previous loyalty to Darius evaporating instantly in the face of my father's overwhelming financial supremacy. They understood clearly that survival in this industry meant aligning with the true source of capital. Jasmine, realizing that her promised future of corporate royalty had just vanished into thin air, turned around and began rushing back up the grand staircase, leaving Darius entirely alone on the stage. My father descended from the platform and walked over to stand by my side. He placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, a silent testament to our unbreakable bond and our shared victory. We looked at the shattered remains of the Sterling family, their arrogance replaced by sheer terror and despair. The lavish gala designed to celebrate their ultimate triumph had transformed into the venue of their complete devastation. This was the justice I had meticulously planned, and it tasted sweeter than any expensive champagne ever could. The silence in the grand ballroom was heavy and absolute. No one moved as the reality of my father's words settled over the terrified crowd. Darius was still leaning against the stage, looking like a broken man. The Vanguard executives were frozen in their seats. Then the spell was broken by the sound of slow, arrogant clapping. Preston stepped forward from the shadows of our VIP table. My white brother-in-law smoothed the lapels of his custom suit and smiled. It was not a smile of defeat. It was the smile of a man who firmly believed he was entirely untouchable. He walked toward the center of the room with the unearned confidence that only generations of unchecked privilege could provide. Preston came from a long line of powerful attorneys who had shaped the laws of this state to protect their own interests. He looked at my father with a mixture of amusement and deep disgust. He stopped a few feet away from us, crossing his arms over his chest. He let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet ballroom. He told my father that it was a very impressive performance. He said the fake documents and the dramatic entrance were certainly entertaining. He shook his head and declared that theatrical stunts do not work in the real world of corporate law. Preston raised his booming courtroom voice, ensuring every single guest could hear his threats. He pointed a finger directly at my father. He announced that his family had been practicing law in this city for over a century. He boasted that his firm represented the most elite institutions in the state. He sneered and called my father a penniless thug trying to run a cheap extortion scam. He said that a black man walking into a luxury hotel claiming to be a billionaire out of nowhere was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. He promised to have my father arrested for corporate espionage, trespassing, and terroristic threats. He bragged that the police chief played golf with his father every Sunday. He stated that in this state, his word and his firm's backing carried far more weight than two grifters crashing a private gala. Preston looked incredibly smug as he delivered his threats. He truly believed his skin color and his family name formed an impenetrable shield around him. He thought he could simply wave his hand and make us disappear into the prison system. Chloe stepped up to stand beside her husband. She looked at me with pure hatred. She clung to Preston's arm, drawing strength from his arrogant display. She told me I was pathetic for dragging my deadbeat father into my messy divorce. She mocked my emerald gown, saying it looked like a cheap imitation of a designer piece. She said I was always trash pretending to be treasure. She laughed and said that no matter what kind of fake documents my father printed out, I was still just a broke nobody who got lucky for a few years. She cheered her husband on telling him to call the police and have us thrown into a holding cell where we belonged. She said she could not wait to watch me beg for a public defender. Preston turned his attention back to me. He took a step closer, invading my personal space to intimidate me. He reminded me about the prenuptial agreement I had just signed. He boasted that he was the one who drafted every single clause of that contract. He said he specifically designed it to leave me utterly destitute if I ever tried to cross his family. He laughed and said I had signed away my rights to any alimony or corporate assets. I declared that even if my father was telling the truth about buying the company, it did not matter because I had legally severed myself from the Sterling family wealth. He told me I was going to walk out of the Ritz-Carlton with absolutely nothing. He promised to make it his personal mission to destroy my reputation so completely that I would never find a job in this city again. He sneered and told me to take my fake billionaire father and walk out the front door before he made a single phone call and ruined both of our lives permanently. I listened to his entire speech without blinking. I let him lay out all his threats and boast about his immense power. I watched him inflate his own ego in front of the silent crowd. I waited until he was completely finished speaking. I looked at Preston and felt a deep, overwhelming sense of pity for his massive ignorance. He was so blinded by his own privilege that he never once considered he might be walking blindly into a trap. He assumed he was the smartest person in the room simply because of his name and his background. He never bothered to look closer at the financial structures he was supposedly protecting. He never realized that the silent woman sitting at the dinner table was observing every single move he made for the past 10 years. I slowly reached into my emerald clutch. The soft sound of the clasp opening seemed incredibly loud in the quiet room. Preston watched me with a smirk, probably expecting me to pull out a tissue to wipe away tears. Chloe rolled her eyes and muttered something about me being overly dramatic. I did not pull out a tissue. I pulled out a sleek black tablet. I held it in my left hand and tapped the screen to wake it up. I looked past Preston and made eye contact with the audio-visual technician standing nervously in the sound booth at the back of the ballroom. The technician was a young man I had hired personally through one of my shell companies to manage the event production tonight. I gave him a subtle nod. I tapped an application on my tablet. The massive presentation screens behind the stage instantly flickered to life. The Vanguard Holdings corporate logo disappeared from the giant displays. It was replaced by a stark white background filled with dense financial spreadsheets. The documents were highly detailed and incredibly complex, but the bold red numbers highlighted at the bottom were impossible to misunderstand. The entire ballroom turned their attention to the massive screens. The board of directors squinted at the projected images, their financial minds quickly deciphering the data displayed before them. The spreadsheets detailed a series of wire transfers dating back 3 years. I looked at Preston. His arrogant smile vanished the exact second he recognized the account numbers on the screen. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the chandelier lights. He took a step back, his eyes darting frantically between my tablet and the giant projection. I spoke clearly, allowing my voice to carry across the silent room. I asked Preston if his prestigious century-old law firm knew about his extracurricular accounting hobbies. I asked him if his powerful father knew that his son was a common thief hiding behind a fancy suit. I pointed to the screens and explained exactly what everyone was looking at. I told the crowd that the documents displayed were internal routing slips from Vanguard Holdings' employee pension fund. I explained that over the last 36 months, exactly $10 million had been quietly siphoned out of the retirement accounts of hard-working employees. I detailed how the money was routed through 3 different dummy corporations registered in Delaware. I explained that those dummy corporations were then used to funnel the stolen funds directly into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I tapped my tablet again. The screen shifted to show the final destination of the embezzled money. The offshore account was clearly registered to an entity named Preston Legal Consulting. The entire ballroom gasped. The sound was a collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. The board of directors erupted into angry whispers. They were looking at indisputable proof of massive federal fraud committed by their own legal counsel. Preston began to shake. He raised his hands defensively, stammering and trying to formulate a coherent sentence. He claimed the documents were forged. He yelled that it was a sophisticated cyber attack designed to frame him. He looked at the board members, begging them not to believe the lies projected on the screen. But his panic was too genuine, his fear was too raw. Everyone in the room could see the absolute guilt radiating from his sweating face. Chloe grabbed his arm, pulling him around to face her. She looked at the screens and then looked at her husband. She screamed at him, asking if it was true. She demanded to know if he had stolen $10 million from her brother's company. Preston tried to shush her, telling her they needed to leave immediately and call his father. He was terrified. The man who had just threatened to destroy my life with a single phone call was now desperately trying to flee the room like a common criminal. He knew that the evidence I had just presented was enough to send him to a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. I walked closer to Preston. I told him that his privilege could not protect him from wire fraud. I explained that the paper trail was verified by 3 independent forensic accounting firms I had hired anonymously months ago. I told him that copies of these exact bank statements had already been sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the State Bar Association. I smiled and told him that his century-old family name was about to become synonymous with the largest corporate embezzlement scandal in state history. I asked him how much weight his word carried now. Preston looked at me with pure terror in his eyes. The arrogant white lawyer who had spent years degrading me was finally seeing me for who I truly was. He realized that the quiet black woman he had constantly dismissed was the architect of his total annihilation. He had underestimated my intelligence, and it was going to cost him his freedom, his career, and his entire life. The ballroom remained in a state of absolute shock as the reality of the situation fully materialized before them. I continued to speak, my voice cutting through the rising panic of the Sterling family. I turned my attention back to the massive screens above us. I tapped my tablet once more. The display shifted, revealing a new set of documents. These were not bank statements. They were highly confidential internal emails from Preston's own prestigious law firm. I explained to the captivated audience that stealing $10 million from a corporate pension fund requires an incredible amount of systemic deception. I told them that Preston did not act alone. He used the resources of his father's century-old firm to mask the transactions. He deliberately drafted legal loopholes into Vanguard's corporate governance policies to ensure the pension fund audits would always overlook the missing capital. The board of directors began shouting angrily from their tables. They demanded immediate answers from Darius, who was still cowering near the edge of the stage. They asked how the chief executive officer could allow $10 million to simply vanish under his watch. Darius tried to distance himself from Preston immediately. He raised his hands and swore he had absolutely no knowledge of the embezzlement. He claimed Preston managed all the legal oversight independently and betrayed his trust. He threw his own brother-in-law under the bus without a second's hesitation, just to save his own skin. It was a pathetic display of cowardice that only further disgusted the wealthy guests watching the spectacle. Preston heard Darius denying everything, and his fear instantly turned into explosive rage. He lunged toward the stage, pointing a trembling finger at my husband. He screamed that Darius was a complete idiot who never read a single financial disclosure report in his entire life. Preston yelled that he had to steal the money to cover the massive legal liabilities Darius created with his reckless real estate acquisitions. He confessed to the embezzlement right there in front of 200 people, trying to justify his crimes by blaming Darius for being an incompetent leader. The two men who had just conspired to throw me out onto the street were now viciously tearing each other apart to avoid federal prison. Chloe stood between them, sobbing uncontrollably. Her perfect evening was completely ruined. Her husband was a confessed felon, and her brother was a deposed failure. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face. She asked me how I could do this to my own family. She begged me to turn off the screens and stop the presentation. I looked at her with absolute indifference. I told her that she lost the right to call me family the day she laughed at my expense. I reminded her that she had just spent the last 10 minutes cheering for my total destruction. I said I was simply showing her the true nature of the men she worshipped. Beatrice was gasping for air, gripping the edge of the table to keep from collapsing onto the marble floor. Her glorious dynasty was burning to ash right before her very eyes. Her son was stripped of his power, and her son-in-law was headed to federal prison. The elite social circles she so desperately craved were watching her family implode with morbid fascination. The prestige and status she valued above all else were permanently erased. I watched her struggle to comprehend the magnitude of her loss. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of superiority, and I had just shattered that illusion into a million irreparable pieces. My father stood beside me, watching the chaos unfold with a calm, satisfied expression. He looked at Preston, who was still shouting at Darius. My father spoke up, his deep voice silencing the two panicking men. He told Preston that the authorities were already reviewing the evidence. He advised the arrogant lawyer to save his breath for the federal prosecutors. He reminded Preston that no amount of old money or country club connections could erase the digital footprints I had meticulously uncovered. He smiled and said that justice in the financial world is blind to pedigree, but highly attentive to forensic accounting. Preston stumbled backward away from the stage. He looked around the ballroom, desperately searching for a friendly face or an ally. He found nothing but cold, judgmental stares. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were ruthless when it came to financial betrayal. Stealing from a pension fund was an unforgivable sin in their circles. Preston realized he was completely isolated. His prestigious law firm would disown him by morning to save their own reputation. His country club friends would delete his number. He was a pariah. He looked at me one last time, his arrogant facade completely replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. The white privilege he had wielded like a weapon, his entire life was completely useless against the undeniable truth projected on the screens. I held my sleek black tablet in my hand, feeling the immense power it contained. I had spent years gathering this intelligence, quietly waiting for the perfect moment to deploy it. I had endured their insults and their condescension, knowing that I held the keys to their absolute destruction. They had mocked my quiet demeanor, mistaking it for weakness. They never understood that true power does not need to scream or boast. True power operates in the shadows, meticulously analyzing every vulnerability and calculating the exact moment to strike. Tonight I stepped out of the shadows. I brought the harsh, illuminating light of reality to their dark, corrupt world. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. The silent wife had become the executioner. Jasmine stood near the bottom of the grand staircase, looking completely terrified as she realized the true extent of the chaos unfolding around her. She had spent the entire evening playing the role of the perfect political princess, ready to ascend to her rightful place beside the new chief executive officer. Now she was trapped in a room full of panicked executives and exposed criminals. She quickly abandoned her regal posture and sprinted toward Darius. She grabbed his arm tightly, pressing her face against his shoulder, and began to sob. She wailed loudly, begging Darius to protect her from this terrible nightmare. She claimed she had no idea what was happening and swore she was just an innocent bystander caught in a vicious corporate dispute. She desperately tried to maintain her carefully constructed image of naive perfection. Darius put his arm around her waist, attempting to shield her from the glaring eyes of the ballroom guests. I was desperate to hold on to the one thing he thought he still possessed, which was the political alliance her family represented. He stroked her hair and whispered empty promises of protection, while ignoring his own massive downfall occurring right behind him now. Beatrice saw her precious political pawn crying and immediately rushed to her defense. She ignored the fact that her son-in-law had just been exposed as a massive federal criminal. She ignored the fact that my father had just legally seized control of her entire family dynasty. Her only concern was salvaging the social standing she believed Jasmine would bring them. Beatrice marched toward me with her face flushed bright red with aristocratic fury. She pointed a manicured finger at me and raised her voice so the entire ballroom could hear her. She declared that I was nothing but a bitter and deeply jealous ex-wife. She accused me of fabricating these ridiculous financial crimes simply because I could not handle being replaced by a younger and far more sophisticated woman. She yelled that I was trying to ruin a beautiful political alliance because my own heart was filled with petty, vindictive poison. Beatrice continued her frantic tirade, attempting to rewrite the reality of the room. She praised Jasmine as a beacon of high society elegance. She insisted that Jasmine's pedigree was absolutely flawless and that her family represented the pinnacle of Black excellence in the state of Georgia today. She told the guests that Jasmine was a pure, untainted soul who had graciously agreed to marry Darius and elevate their family name. She sneered at me, stating that a woman from my low-class background could never understand the complex dynamics of elite political marriages. She claimed I was trying to drag a prominent state senator's daughter through the mud just to satisfy my own pathetic insecurities. She demanded that my father call off his private security guards and apologize to Jasmine for causing her such immense emotional distress. I stood perfectly still and let Beatrice exhaust herself with her ridiculous delusions. I did not interrupt her frantic defense of the woman who was meant to replace me. I simply watched the pathetic display of a matriarch desperately clinging to a sinking ship. When Beatrice finally ran out of breath and stopped shouting, I turned my attention away from her and looked directly at Jasmine. The crying mistress peeked out from behind my husband's shoulder, still attempting to look frail and victimized. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. I pointed to the heavy diamond pendant resting against her collarbone, and I smiled very softly indeed right now. I noted that the necklace was a very specific and incredibly expensive vintage piece. I spoke clearly so the entire room could hear my observation. I explained that the diamond pendant Jasmine was currently wearing was not a family heirloom passed down from her prominent political father. I told the crowd that I knew exactly where that necklace came from, because I was the one who purchased it. I revealed that I had personally selected and bought that exact piece of jewelry last Christmas as a gift for Beatrice. I had paid for it using the bonus I earned from saving Vanguard from yet another one of my husband's disastrous financial mistakes. I looked at Beatrice and asked her why her future daughter-in-law was wearing the jewelry I had bought for her. I asked if Darius had stolen it from his mother's vault to impress his new mistress, or if Beatrice had simply handed it over to bribe the state senator's daughter into marrying her incompetent son. Beatrice touched her bare neck, instinctively her face paling, as she realized she had been caught in a pathetic lie right in front of all her prestigious and judgmental friends today. Jasmine stopped her fake crying and touched the diamond pendant, her eyes darting nervously between Darius and his mother. I told Jasmine that her pure and flawless pedigree was nothing but a carefully manufactured illusion. I explained that she was not marrying Darius for love or for political legacy. I stated that her father was facing a massive campaign finance deficit, and she needed a wealthy husband to quietly fund his upcoming re-election bid. I told the ballroom that Jasmine was nothing but a high-priced political mercenary willing to marry a fool like Darius just to access the Vanguard corporate treasury. I smiled and told her that it was a terrible shame the treasury was now entirely under my father's absolute control. Jasmine immediately dropped her fragile victim act, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered hatred. She stepped away from Darius and glared at me with absolute fury. She demanded to know who I thought I was to speak to her in such a disrespectful manner. She threatened to call her father back and have his political allies destroy my entire existence. She boasted that her family had generations of political influence inside this state indeed. She claimed that my father was just new money hiding in the shadows. She stated that the Sterling family was incredibly lucky to have her, and that I was just a sad, pathetic woman, making up wild stories to ruin a wedding I could never compete with. She told me I had absolutely zero proof of her intentions, and that her pristine reputation would easily survive the rambling accusations of a discarded wife. I looked down at the sleek black tablet still resting securely in my left hand. I tapped the screen and closed the financial documents that had just destroyed my brother-in-law. I opened a separate secure application. I looked back up at Jasmine and told her that my father taught me never to enter a negotiation without holding all the leverage. I told her that I never make an accusation without possessing undeniable concrete proof. I looked at the audio-visual technician in the back of the room and gave him another subtle nod. I tapped the tablet screen one more time. The massive ballroom speakers clicked and hummed as a new digital file loaded into the system, cutting through the noise completely and totally now. The audio recording was incredibly crisp and undeniably real. The first voice that echoed through the ballroom was Jasmine's. She was laughing a deep, throaty sound that was completely different from the polite giggle she used at high society events. The second voice belonged to Preston. My white brother-in-law was speaking in a hushed, intimate tone. The recording clearly captured the unmistakable background noise of a luxury hotel room, complete with the sound of ice clinking in expensive glass tumblers. The entire ballroom froze in absolute disbelief as they realized they were listening to a private, secret conversation between my husband's new mistress and my husband's sister's husband. The sheer audacity of the betrayal caused several guests to cover their mouths in shock. On the recording, Preston was telling Jasmine how easy it would be to manipulate Darius. Preston's recorded voice echoed through the speakers, calling Darius a complete moron who was too busy picking out expensive suits to notice his own company bleeding cash. Jasmine laughed again on the tape and agreed with him. Her recorded voice stated that marrying Darius was going to be the absolute easiest job she ever had completed today. My friend indeed. She told Preston that her father needed $5 million for his campaign fund by the end of the quarter and that Vanguard was the perfect piggy bank. She promised Preston that once she was officially married to Darius, she would convince him to approve a series of massive consulting contracts. She said those contracts would funnel millions directly into Preston's offshore accounts, allowing them to quietly split the stolen money. Darius looked physically ill as he listened to her words. The recording continued to play, stripping away every single layer of Jasmine's fake perfection. Preston told her that he had already drafted the corporate governance loopholes needed to bypass the board of directors. He bragged about how he was going to drain Vanguard completely dry within 2 years. He promised Jasmine that once the company filed for bankruptcy, they could take their stolen millions and move to Europe, leaving Darius and his entire arrogant family to face the criminal fallout alone. The tape captured the sound of them clinking their glasses together in a celebratory toast to their brilliant criminal conspiracy. It ended with Jasmine telling Preston that he was far more useful in bed than Darius was today. I tapped the tablet and locked the screen, entirely shutting off the audio feed. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The entire room processed the magnitude of the conspiracy they had just heard. Jasmine and Preston were not just having a secret physical affair. They were actively conspiring to completely gut the Sterling family empire and leave Darius holding the bag for massive federal fraud. Jasmine stood absolutely paralyzed, her flawless makeup unable to hide the sheer terror spreading across her face. Her political career, her social standing, and her fake innocent persona were permanently obliterated in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta. She looked at Darius, but he was staring at her with an expression of pure, sickened horror, stepping entirely away from her. Preston was still standing near our table, his face ashen and his hands trembling violently. He had just been exposed as an embezzler, and now he was exposed as a traitor to his own marriage. He slowly turned his head to look at his wife. Chloe had been standing right next to him the entire time. She had spent the last 10 minutes defending him and screaming at me continuously today. Now she was staring at the man she had loved and trusted for years. The realization of his profound betrayal hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Her husband was not just stealing from her brother's company. He was sleeping with her brother's future wife and planning to leave their family completely destitute and facing federal prison. The perfect illusion of her marriage was gone forever. Chloe began to shake uncontrollably. Her eyes darted from Preston to Jasmine and back to Preston. The arrogant entitlement she had displayed all evening completely vanished. She was stripped bare, humiliated in front of her peers, and destroyed by the two people her family had eagerly welcomed into their inner circle. Preston raised his hands and took a step toward his wife. He opened his mouth, attempting to formulate some kind of pathetic excuse or legal defense. He tried to tell her that the recording was somehow doctored or taken completely out of context. He begged her to listen to him and not believe the lies I was projecting into the room. Chloe did not say a word. She simply stepped forward and slapped him directly across his face, ending everything today. The sound of Chloe slapping Preston echoed through the grand ballroom with a sharp, sickening crack. The wealthy guests gasped, watching the Sterling family tear itself apart in real time. Preston stumbled backward, holding his red cheek, his arrogance shattered by his wife's violence. Chloe was sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her husband's ultimate betrayal sank in. He had not just stolen millions of dollars from her brother's company. He had slept with this woman her mother handpicked to elevate their status. Jasmine was cowering near the stage, her crimson gown trembling as her reputation crushed her. Darius looked hollowed out, staring blankly at the people conspiring to send him to prison. But Beatrice could not accept defeat. She refused to let her dynasty crumble without a fight. Beatrice stepped away from the table, her face twisted into a mask of pure rage. She ignored her sobbing daughter and her disgraced son-in-law. She marched directly toward me, her high heels stomping against the marble floor. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at my face, her chest heaving for breath. She decided to attack the one thing she believed she still controlled. She screamed that I was a deceitful little rat who orchestrated this circus to steal their wealth. She yelled that my father could not buy class or pedigree. She declared that I was still nothing but a homeless charity case who got lucky 10 years ago. She reminded the ballroom that I came from a broken home with absolutely nothing. She boasted that Darius put clothes on my back and a roof over my head. She announced she was going to use her remaining power to strip me of everything. Beatrice raised her voice so the executives could hear her final desperate threat. She told me that the magnificent $10 million estate in Buckhead belonged entirely to her son. She reminded the room how she visited that house to point out I was merely a guest. She recounted running her fingers over the expensive furniture, stating Darius had impeccable taste. She screamed she was calling her private security team to throw my belongings onto the street. She promised I would be sleeping in a cheap motel tonight. She vowed to watch the guards drag me out into the cold. I stood perfectly still and let her scream her desperate threats. She believed throwing me out of a house would negate the fact that her empire was burning. She thought homelessness was the ultimate humiliation because she placed all her value in material possessions. I did not interrupt her frantic tirade. I walked over to a passing waiter standing frozen near the edge of the stage. I gently took a crystal flute of expensive champagne from his silver tray. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cool liquid wash down my throat. The bubbles contrasted beautifully with the heavy, toxic atmosphere of the room. I turned back to face my mother-in-law. I held the champagne glass gracefully in my right hand. I told Beatrice that she was absolutely correct about the deed to the Buckhead estate. I acknowledged that Darius purchased that home and put the title solely in his name. I agreed he was incredibly protective of his assets, making sure I never had any legal claim. I smiled and told her his selfish obsession was actually the greatest gift he could have given me. Beatrice stopped screaming and stared at me in deep confusion. She did not understand why I was smiling at the prospect of being evicted. I explained the complex financial reality of her son's lavish lifestyle. I told her, Darius lived like a billionaire, but only had the salary of a regional director. I asked Beatrice how he managed to buy a $10 million mansion on a corporate salary. I watched her face pale as the implications began to sink in. I explained Darius did not buy that house with cash. He bought it using a massive margin loan from a private offshore bank. I told the ballroom Darius used his executive stock options in Vanguard Holdings as collateral. He gambled his entire stake in the family company just to live in a house he could not afford. I walked slowly toward Darius, who was leaning heavily against the podium looking physically ill. I told my husband collateralized debt is a very dangerous game when you do not control the market. I explained that when a borrower uses stock as collateral, the bank closely monitors its value. If the company faces a hostile takeover, the bank gets very nervous. I turned my attention back to Beatrice, who was now shaking uncontrollably. I told her my father's private equity firm took control of Vanguard Holdings 3 minutes ago. I explained this hostile takeover triggered a mandatory review of all executive margin loans. The offshore bank immediately recognized Darius was no longer the chief executive officer. I watched the absolute horror spread across Beatrice's face as I delivered the final crushing blow. I explained the beautiful legal protection of the divorce papers I had just signed at the dinner table. I told her because Darius had forced me to sign a brutal prenuptial agreement and an immediate divorce decree, I was completely absolved of all shared marital debt. The $10 million margin loan belonged exclusively to him. I was completely legally and financially free from his disastrous real estate decisions. But I did not stop there. I told Beatrice that I was not a woman who leaves things to chance. I explained that earlier this morning, my anonymous proxy firm contacted that offshore bank. I told the ballroom that I personally bought the $10 million debt from the bank at a premium. I took one final sip of my champagne and looked directly into Beatrice's terrified eyes. I told her that I was now the sole owner of her son's massive debt. I explained that because the loan was in default due to the sudden corporate takeover, I had the legal right to call in the debt immediately. I told her that if Darius could not produce $10 million in cash right now, the estate would be instantly seized by the creditor. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile and reminded her that she was the one currently living in the guest house on that exact same Buckhead estate. I told her that she had sold her own home 2 years ago to move into her son's mansion because she wanted to play the role of the grand matriarch. I set my empty champagne glass down on the table with a soft clink. I told Beatrice that she was not going to evict me tonight because I did not live there anymore. I explained that my security team had already moved all my personal belongings into a luxury penthouse downtown while we were busy getting dressed for this gala. I leaned in close enough to see the tears of pure terror welling up in her eyes. I whispered that the eviction notice was not for me. It was for her. I told her that my private security contractors were currently waiting at the gates of the Buckhead estate. I informed her that she and Darius had exactly until midnight to pack their bags and vacate my property. I told her that if they were not gone by the stroke of midnight, my team would physically drag them out onto the street and leave them on the curb. The matriarch who had spent 10 years treating me like a stray dog was now officially homeless. The silence that blanketed the Ritz-Carlton ballroom was so profound, it felt as though the entire building had been submerged underwater. 200 of the most wealthy and influential people in the city of Atlanta stood completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the devastation they were witnessing. They had come to this gala expecting to celebrate the coronation of a new corporate king, and instead they were watching an entire dynasty be systematically eradicated by a woman they had all collectively ignored for a decade. Beatrice stumbled backward away from me, her expensive designer heels catching on the thick carpet. She reached out blindly, trying to find something to hold on to, but her hands only grasped empty air. She fell hard against the edge of a vacant dining table, sending silverware clattering loudly to the polished marble floor. The sound was harsh and metallic, cutting through the heavy tension like a knife. She did not try to stand back up. She simply slid down the side of the table until she was sitting on the floor, her beautiful cream-colored gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She looked up at me from the ground, her eyes wide and bloodshot. The arrogant, powerful matriarch who had ruled high society with an iron fist was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, broken elderly woman who suddenly realized she had absolutely nowhere to go. She had spent her entire adult life hoarding wealth and looking down on anyone who could not afford to live in her exclusive zip code. She had measured human worth entirely by bank account balances and property deeds. Now she had $0 in her bank account and zero properties to her name. She had built a fortress of arrogance, and I had just detonated the very foundation it stood upon. I looked down at her, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over my spirit. I remembered all the times she had made me sit at the far end of the dinner table during family holidays. I remembered the time she threw away the anniversary gift I had spent months saving up to buy for her, calling it cheap trash fit only for a maid. I remembered her telling my husband that my bloodline would poison their perfect family tree. She thought her cruelty made her strong, but it had only made me incredibly patient. I had endured her psychological abuse because I knew that true revenge requires meticulous planning and absolute precision. I did not want to just insult her or argue with her. I wanted to dismantle her entire reality so completely that she would never be able to rebuild it again. Darius finally moved, stepping away from the podium and walking unsteadily toward his mother. He looked like a ghost, his face completely drained of color, and his hands shaking uncontrollably at his sides. He knelt down next to Beatrice, trying to help her up, but she violently swatted his hands away. She looked at her son with a mixture of horror and deep resentment. She realized that his incompetence and his arrogant financial gambling had caused this ultimate catastrophe. The golden child she had worshipped and protected had gambled away her home and her future just to maintain an illusion of grandeur. He tried to speak, to apologize to her, but the words caught in his throat. He looked up at me from the floor, his eyes begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. He wanted me to tell him it was all a terrible joke. He wanted me to say I would forgive him and give him back the life I had just destroyed. He opened his mouth to beg, but my father stepped forward, placing himself firmly between me and the pathetic man on the floor. My father did not say a single word. He did not need to. His imposing presence and his cold, calculating stare told Darius everything he needed to know. There would be no mercy tonight. There would be no second chances or quiet settlements. The eviction would proceed exactly as I had outlined. The clock was ticking, and midnight was rapidly approaching. They had less than 3 hours to pack up their entire lives and disappear into the cold, unforgiving night. Darius watched his perfect world completely disintegrate. He saw his mother weeping on the floor and his sister trembling in shock after striking her husband. The realization that he was entirely isolated finally pierced through his overwhelming arrogance. He knew he could not rely on his disgraced family to save him anymore. He needed powerful allies, and he needed them immediately. He turned his desperate attention away from his ruined relatives and looked directly at the front row of the ballroom. The Vanguard Holdings Board of Directors sat around a massive circular table draped in expensive blue silk. These were the men who held the ultimate corporate authority. They were the veteran power brokers of Atlanta. They controlled massive blocks of institutional voting shares that could potentially stall or complicate a hostile takeover. Darius wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He leaned forward and began to plead for his corporate life. He addressed the board members by their first names, trying to invoke the deep bonds of their exclusive boys' club. He looked at the chairman and begged him to intervene. He reminded the older men of the countless weekends they spent playing golf at the most prestigious country clubs in the state. He brought up the lavish private dinners they shared at expensive steakhouses, where they smoked imported cigars and planned the future of the company. Darius tried to leverage years of corporate brotherhood to save his sinking ship. He told the board that they could not possibly allow this hostile takeover to happen. He claimed my father and I were nothing but hostile invaders trying to steal their collective legacy. He warned them that we did not understand the unique culture of Vanguard Holdings. He painted us as ruthless outsiders who would dismantle the company and sell off the pieces for parts. He begged the board to use their emergency voting powers to freeze the acquisition and block my father's private equity firm from taking operational control. I was speaking incredibly fast, his words stumbling over each other in his sheer panic. He saw the cold, impassive expressions on the faces of the board members and realized his appeals to friendship were not working. These men did not care about golf games or expensive dinners when their fortunes were on the line. Darius knew he had to offer them something much more valuable to secure their loyalty. He took a deep breath and deployed what he believed was his ultimate weapon. He reminded the board of the spectacular financial projections he had presented during his inaugural speech just an hour ago. He pointed to the massive screens behind him that had recently displayed his brother-in-law's crimes. He yelled that he was the only leader who could deliver the legendary 30% profit margins he had promised for the upcoming fiscal year. Darius shouted that the aggressive expansion model was his own brilliant creation. He insisted that if the board allowed my father to remove him as chief executive officer, those unprecedented profits would vanish instantly. He promised the executives that if they stood behind him tonight and fought off the takeover, he would make them wealthier than they had ever imagined. He told them he had a master plan to dominate the entire southeastern real estate market. He begged them to trust his vision and reject the hostile invaders standing in the middle of their gala. He pleaded with them to protect the financial future he had meticulously designed for them. He stood on the stage, panting heavily, looking like a desperate salesman pitching a worthless product to an audience of seasoned buyers. I stood next to my father and watched my husband humiliate himself. I did not interrupt his frantic speech. I simply observed him thrashing around in the trap I had spent years building. He genuinely believed that his charisma and his stolen ideas could save him from total ruin. He thought the greedy old men sitting at the front table would blind themselves to reality just to chase the 30% profit margins he dangled in front of them. He completely forgot the cardinal rule of high-level finance, which is that loyalty only belongs to the person who actually controls the money. The 12 members of the Vanguard Holdings Board of Directors looked at each other in silence. They communicated through subtle nods and raised eyebrows. They were calculating the risks and analyzing the shifting power dynamics of the room. The chairman of the board, a tall, distinguished man with silver hair, slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. The other 11 board members immediately followed his lead, standing up in perfect unison. Darius let out a loud breath of relief. A massive, triumphant smile spread across his sweating face. He truly believed his desperate pitch had worked. He thought the board of directors was standing up to support him and defend his position as chief executive officer. He raised his hand, reaching out to welcome them to his side. But the board members did not look at Darius. They did not walk toward the stage where he stood waiting for his corporate salvation. They turned their backs on him entirely. The chairman led the group of 12 powerful executives away from the VIP tables. They walked in a slow, deliberate procession, right past the stage, completely in bewilderment. He watched in stunned silence as the most powerful men in his company walked directly toward me. The board members stopped a few feet away from where my father and I stood. They did not shout or make any threatening gestures. Instead, they did something that made Beatrice gasp from her pathetic position on the floor. The 12 wealthy executives bowed their heads respectfully toward me and my father. It was a clear, undeniable display of absolute submission. They were publicly acknowledging the new supreme power in the room. They were surrendering their loyalty to the people who had just bought their entire company out from under them. The chairman stepped forward, holding his hands clasped politely in front of him. He looked directly at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of profound awe and deep respect. He cleared his throat and spoke in a steady, measured voice that carried easily to the stage where Darius was standing frozen in shock. The chairman addressed my husband without looking at him. He stated that the board of directors had a very important revelation to share regarding the aggressive expansion model Darius had pitched to them. He explained that the entire board was fully aware that Darius did not possess the intellect to create such a sophisticated financial strategy. The chairman revealed that the board had received the legendary 30% profit margin model 3 months ago. He explained that the incredibly detailed projections were sent to them directly from a highly respected anonymous consultant known within elite financial circles only by the single initial M. He told the silent ballroom that Consultant M had an impeccable track record for predicting market fluctuations and structuring flawless acquisitions. The board had approved the expansion plan entirely based on the reputation of Consultant M. They had only allowed Darius to present it tonight as a ceremonial formality because he was the face of the Sterling family. Darius gripped the podium, his eyes wide with rising panic, as the chairman continued his devastating explanation. The chairman turned his full attention back to me and smiled. He told the crowd that just before the gala began, the board had received a highly confidential briefing from the legal team representing Apex Capital. He explained that the briefing contained irrefutable proof regarding the true identity of Consultant M. The chairman bowed his head to me once more. He announced to the entire ballroom that the brilliant anonymous consultant who designed the 30% profit model was none other than Savannah. The room erupted in loud, shocked whispers. The guests could hardly believe what they were hearing. The quiet, unremarkable wife of the new chief executive officer was actually a legendary financial genius. She was the secret architect behind the most lucrative business strategy in the history of Vanguard Holdings. She was the mastermind who had been quietly manipulating the real estate market from the shadows. The socialites who had spent the evening ignoring me now stared at me with wide eyes full of sudden desperate respect. The politicians who had catered to Beatrice suddenly realized they had been courting the wrong woman for an entire decade. I looked past the bowing chairman and locked eyes with Darius. The realization hit him like a freight train. I could literally see the exact second his brain connected all the missing pieces. He remembered the nights I sat at the kitchen table typing on my laptop while he watched television. He remembered how I casually suggested minor adjustments to his reports that mysteriously transformed his failing projects into massive successes. He remembered the time I handed him a completely finished spreadsheet and told him it would guarantee his promotion to regional director. Darius finally understood that he had never been the brains of his own operation. He had never been a visionary leader or a corporate titan. He was nothing but a hollow puppet, and I had been pulling his strings for 10 long years. Every single accomplishment on his resume belonged to me. Every dollar he claimed to have earned for the company was generated by my intellect. He was a fraud in an expensive suit, and he had just discarded the only reason he was ever successful. He had traded a financial genius for a political mistress who only wanted to steal his money. He collapsed to his knees on the stage, his legs no longer able to support the crushing weight of his absolute failure. He looked like a small, terrified boy who had just been caught playing dress-up in his father's closet. He buried his face in his hands, weeping openly in front of the people he had tried to impress. The golden child of the Sterling dynasty was completely destroyed. He had lost his wife, his company, his wealth, and his entire identity in the span of 30 minutes. How was a king without a kingdom? A brilliant facade that had just been shattered to reveal the empty void within. I stood there, bathed in the glow of the crystal chandeliers, feeling no sympathy for the sobbing man on the stage. I had given him 10 years to become a better person. I had given him endless opportunities to value my contributions and treat me with genuine respect. He chose arrogance instead. He chose cruelty and betrayal. He chose to humiliate me publicly to satisfy his own pathetic ego. He dug his own grave, and I simply provided the shovel. The chairman of the board stepped back, returning to his colleagues. They stood behind my father and me, forming a solid wall of corporate support. They had pledged their allegiance to the true power in the room, abandoning the sinking ship of the Sterling family without a single ounce of hesitation. I looked at Beatrice, who was still sitting on the marble floor staring blankly at her weeping son. Her grand illusion of superiority was permanently erased. Her family was a public laughingstock. The empire she had spent her life protecting was now firmly in the hands of the woman she despised. The boardroom defection was absolute and total. There was no one left to defend Darius. There was no one left to validate his delusions of grandeur. He was completely alone, surrounded by the wreckage of his own catastrophic decisions. I turned my gaze away from the pathetic display on the stage and looked at my father. He gave me a slow, satisfied nod, acknowledging the flawless execution of our long-awaited plan. The trap had closed perfectly, and the true queen of Vanguard Holdings had finally claimed her rightful throne. My husband tried to erase me, but instead he gave me the perfect opportunity to erase his entire life. The man who thought he ruled the world was now crying on the floor, begging for a mercy he would absolutely never receive from me or my father. I watched the broken man tremble as his legacy turned to ash. I smiled, knowing my victory was absolute. Every single lie he told, every cruel remark he made, and every betrayal he planned had led him exactly to this miserable end. I looked at the executives and told them that Vanguard was now under new management, and the old regime was officially dead, forever. They nodded in agreement, ready to follow my lead into a much brighter and far more profitable future without Darius. I felt the heavy weight of 10 years of suppression lift off my shoulders. I was no longer the quiet wife in the background. I was the absolute, undisputed master of my own destiny. The room waited for my next command, completely under my control. I let the silence stretch for a moment, savoring the sheer power of the moment before preparing to deliver the final killing blow to the remnants of the Sterling dynasty. Darius lifted his tear-stained face from his hands and looked at me. His eyes begged for a lifeline that simply did not exist. I stared back at him with eyes as cold as ice. The board members stood silently behind me, awaiting my orders. The era of the Sterling family was permanently finished, and they knew it. I had meticulously planned this beautiful destruction for a decade. The Phantom Consultant had stepped into the light to reclaim her stolen crown. The glorious revenge I had orchestrated was finally complete and absolute. Jasmine had retreated halfway up the grand staircase, but the devastating spectacle unfolding below her finally broke through her initial shock. She watched Darius weeping uncontrollably on the polished marble floor and realized that the golden ticket she thought she held was completely worthless. The corporate treasury she had conspired to drain alongside Preston was now firmly locked behind my security protocols. Her meticulously calculated plan to fund her father's political campaign, using my husband's stolen wealth, had just evaporated into thin air. Instead of cutting her losses and quietly walking out the front doors, she made the worst possible decision. Her fear morphed directly into violent, explosive anger. She marched back down the marble steps, her expensive crimson gown swishing furiously around her ankles. She gripped her designer clutch so tightly, her knuckles turned pale white. She stopped a few feet away from where my father and I stood, surrounded by the loyal board of directors. Jasmine glared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. She refused to accept that a woman she deemed socially inferior had just outsmarted her. She reached into her clutch and pulled out her smartphone, holding it up like a weapon ready to fire. She pointed the device directly at my face and raised her voice so the entire silent ballroom could hear her desperate threats. She declared that I had absolutely no idea who I was messing with tonight. She screamed that her father was the most powerful state senator in Georgia, and that he would absolutely destroy me for embarrassing his daughter in front of the Atlanta elite. She sneered and told me that generational political influence always trumps new money. She claimed my father and I were nothing but commoners trying to play a rich man's game, and we were about to learn a very painful lesson about real power. She boasted that her family had been shaping the laws and regulations of this state for decades, long before I ever figured out how to manipulate a corporate spreadsheet. She promised to unleash regulatory hell on our capital by tomorrow morning. She swore her father would order immediate tax audits and federal investigations into every single business my father and I owned. She yelled that she would have our assets frozen, our licenses revoked, and our entire shadow empire burned to the ground before the week was over. Jasmine was practically vibrating with arrogant entitlement. She truly believed that her father's political seat gave her immunity from all consequences. She looked around the ballroom, expecting the wealthy guests to nod in agreement. She wanted them to validate her superior social standing. She told the crowd that I was just a bitter, jealous ex-wife throwing a tantrum because I could not secure my own marriage. She claimed her father would make sure my name became completely toxic in every financial circle across the country. She promised that once the state senate initiated a targeted inquiry into my proxy firms, I would be begging for mercy on my hands and knees. She looked at Darius, who was still cowering on the floor, and told him he was a pathetic loser for letting a woman like me steal his company. She declared that his family was weak, but the political dynasty of her own family was entirely untouchable. She held her phone higher and announced she was calling the senator right now to end my miserable existence. She unlocked her screen, her painted fingernails tapping aggressively on the glass surface. I stood my ground and watched her throw this spectacular tantrum. I did not interrupt her endless stream of desperate threats. I simply observed the fascinating psychological unraveling of a woman who relied entirely on the accomplishments of men to give her value. Jasmine had never built a single thing in her entire life. She merely traded on her father's political capital and her own physical beauty to extract wealth from incompetent men like Darius and Preston. She thought her proximity to government power made her invincible. She assumed I would cower in fear the moment she invoked the senator's name. She expected me to beg her to put the phone away, to offer her a financial settlement, to keep her powerful father out of my corporate affairs. She completely underestimated the depth of my preparation. I looked at Jasmine and smiled a very calm, knowing smile. I gestured toward the smartphone clutched tightly in her trembling hand. I spoke in a quiet, steady voice that carried effortlessly across the quiet room. I told Jasmine to go ahead and make the call. I politely requested that she put the senator on speakerphone so we could all hear his voice. Jasmine looked momentarily confused by my absolute lack of fear. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the dial button. She searched my face for any sign of bluffing, but she found nothing except cold, calculated confidence. Her arrogance quickly overrode her brief hesitation. She scoffed and told me I was making the biggest mistake of my miserable life. She pressed the button and activated the speakerphone, holding the device out in front of her like a shield. The dial tone echoed loudly through the ballroom, amplified by the absolute silence of the 200 guests, watching the drama unfold. The phone rang 3 times before a deep, authoritative voice answered on the other end. The senator sounded tired and slightly annoyed by the late-night interruption. He barked his daughter's name and asked why she was calling him at this hour, knowing he was busy preparing for his upcoming re-election campaign. Jasmine instantly shifted her entire demeanor. The vicious, threatening woman vanished and was immediately replaced by the fragile, innocent victim. She forced tears into her eyes and let out a dramatic, whimpering sob designed to manipulate her father's protective instincts. She cried into the speakerphone, telling the senator that she had been viciously attacked at the inauguration gala. She wailed that a crazy woman named Savannah had completely ruined the event and humiliated their family name in front of the entire city. She claimed I was a deranged stalker who illegally hacked into the corporate systems to steal Darius away from her. She begged her father to use his political connections to destroy my life and lock me in prison. She cried that she was completely terrified and needed him to deploy his regulatory power to shut down our businesses by sunrise. The senator immediately shifted into his aggressive political persona. His voice boomed through the speakerphone, promising swift and absolute retribution. He swore he would make sure the Attorney General opened an immediate criminal investigation into my finances. He told Jasmine to stay calm and promised that he would personally ensure I never saw the light of day again for daring to disrespect his precious daughter. Jasmine smirked at me through her fake tears, clearly believing she had just won the ultimate victory. She thought her daddy had just handed her my severed head on a silver platter. I listened to the senator's angry promises with complete indifference. When he finally paused to take a breath, I stepped forward, closing the distance between Jasmine and myself. I spoke directly toward the glowing smartphone. I introduced myself simply as Savannah. I told the senator it was a distinct pleasure to finally speak with him after spending so much time reviewing his campaign finance records. The senator abruptly stopped talking. The sudden silence on the other end of the line was palpable. He demanded to know who I was and how I dared to speak to him in such a disrespectful manner. He reiterated his threat to have me arrested for harassing his daughter. I did not raise my voice. I kept my tone perfectly level and professional. I told the senator that before he mobilized the attorney general to investigate my corporate holdings, he might want to take a very close look at the primary funding source for his own current re-election campaign. I asked him if he was familiar with a specific dark money political action committee registered under the name Liberty Forward Initiatives. I stated the name clearly, ensuring every syllable resonated through the silent ballroom. The senator gasped audibly over the speakerphone. The aggressive bravado completely vanished from his voice. I knew exactly what Liberty Forward Initiatives was. It was the massive anonymous political action committee that had quietly bankrolled his entire political career for the last 4 years. It was the invisible financial engine that paid for his expensive television advertisements, his luxury campaign buses, and his lavish fundraising dinners. He stammered, asking how I knew the name of that highly classified organization. I smiled, looking directly at Jasmine's confused face. I told the senator that I did not just know the name of the organization. I told him that I was the sole managing director of that dark money political action committee. I explained that my proxy firm created that entity to shape the regional political landscape and protect my corporate interests. I told him that I personally authorized every single $1 million deposit that kept his failing political career afloat. I informed the senator that the money funding his lavish lifestyle was generated entirely by my brilliant financial strategies. I was the silent hand feeding his political ambitions, and I could just as easily starve him to death. Jasmine stared at the phone in sheer terror. She looked at me and then looked at the device, shaking her head in denial. She whispered that I was lying and that I could not possibly control her father's political destiny. I ignored her and continued speaking to the senator. I told him that I possessed complete documentation of every single wire transfer sent from my corporate accounts to his campaign managers. I told him I also possessed irrefutable proof that he had illegally used a significant portion of those campaign funds to pay off his own personal gambling debts. I heard the senator choke on his own breath. His silence was the ultimate confirmation of his absolute guilt. But I was not finished dismantling his life just yet. I told the senator that while he was busy hiding stolen campaign money, his precious daughter was busy plotting a massive federal crime. I explained that Jasmine was not an innocent victim. I told him she was actively conspiring to embezzle $10 million from the employee pension fund. I informed him that she was carrying on a sordid secret affair with the married white corporate lawyer named Preston. I told the senator that I had already played a crystal-clear audio recording of his daughter's disgusting criminal conspiracy for 200 of the most influential people in the city. I explained that the recording explicitly detailed Jasmine's plan to use the stolen pension money to illegally fund his upcoming re-election bid. I told him that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was already reviewing the evidence I provided. I informed the powerful politician that his daughter's reckless greed had just permanently tied his name to the largest corporate fraud scandal in the history of the state. I asked the senator if he still wanted to call the attorney general to investigate me, or if he would prefer to start looking for a very good criminal defense lawyer for himself. The silence stretching over the speakerphone was absolute and devastating. Jasmine began to weep for real this time, realizing that she had just backed her powerful father into an inescapable corner. She cried out to him, begging him to say something to tell me I was wrong to use his power to save her. She pleaded with him to protect her just like he always did. The senator's voice finally returned, but it sounded completely broken and hollow. He did not yell or threaten me. I did not promise retribution or regulatory hell. He spoke directly to his daughter, and his words were laced with pure survival instinct and deep disgust. He told Jasmine that she was a complete fool. He told her she had ruined everything he spent his entire life building. He screamed that her pathetic greed had just destroyed his political legacy and exposed him to federal prison. Jasmine sobbed, clutching the phone tightly, screaming that she only did it to help him get the $5 million he needed for the campaign. The senator cut her off brutally. He told her to shut her mouth and never contact him again. He stated clearly and loudly that he had absolutely no knowledge of her illegal activities and that she was entirely on her own. He told her she was dead to him. Then the loud, sharp click of the call disconnecting echoed through the ballroom. The powerful state senator had chosen self-preservation over his own daughter, throwing her directly under the bus to save his own skin. Jasmine stood paralyzed, holding the disconnected phone in her trembling hand. The dial tone buzzed quietly, a mocking soundtrack to her total defeat. She had tried to leverage generational political influence against me, but she failed to realize that true power is entirely agnostic. Money dictates politics, and I controlled the money. She slowly lowered the phone, her flawless crimson gown looking incredibly heavy on her shaking frame. The wealthy guests who had admired her just an hour ago now looked at her with blatant revulsion. She was no longer a high society princess. She was a confessed criminal who had just been publicly disowned by her own father. The political shield she had hidden behind her entire life had evaporated, leaving her completely exposed to the harsh reality of federal prosecution. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a profound, consuming terror. She finally understood that she had picked a fight with a woman who operated 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. She realized I was not playing a rich man's game. I was the one who designed the entire board. I stepped back and stood beside my father. I did not offer Jasmine a single word of comfort. She had chosen to participate in my destruction, and now she was choking on the ashes of her own failed conspiracy. I watched her stumble backward away from the center of the room, looking frantically for an exit that would not require her to walk past the judging eyes of the elite. There was nowhere for her to hide. Her beautiful illusion was completely shattered, revealing the greedy, desperate reality underneath. The political checkmate was absolutely flawless. I had neutralized the most powerful external threat in the room without raising my voice or breaking a single sweat. The board of directors watched the entire exchange in silent reverence. They witnessed me dismantle a powerful state senator with a single phone call, cementing my status as the undisputed apex predator of this corporate jungle. The final remnants of Darius and his pathetic allies were completely eradicated, leaving nothing but a clear path for my father and me to claim our rightful empire. Preston watched the absolute destruction of his secret lover and her powerful political father with wide, terrified eyes. He stood near the edge of the shattered table, nursing the stinging red mark on his cheek where his wife Chloe had just struck him. He realized that the intricate web of deception he had spent years weaving was completely unraveling before his eyes. The stolen pension funds, the offshore accounts, the secret affair and the plan to bankrupt Vanguard were all laid bare for the entire city to see. He knew the digital evidence I projected was enough to ruin him. He looked at Darius, who was still sobbing weakly on the marble floor, and then he looked at me. The sheer panic in Preston's eyes began to harden into something entirely different. It morphed into a desperate, cornered rage. He was a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire privileged life. He came from a long, unbroken line of wealthy elite lawyers who believed the rules simply did not apply to them. I was not going to surrender to a woman he considered so far beneath his social standing. He reached a trembling hand inside. He pulled out his smartphone and gripped it tightly. He decided to play the absolute final card he held in his incredibly corrupt hand. Preston looked around the silent ballroom, breathing heavily as he frantically scrolled through his contacts. He found the specific number he was looking for and pressed the dial button with a vicious, aggressive jab of his thumb. He raised the phone to his ear and glared at my father and me with a renewed sense of arrogant confidence. I was calling the local chief of police, hoping to use his ultimate white privilege against us today. The police chief was not just a casual acquaintance or a professional contact. He was a close personal friend of Preston's wealthy family. They played golf together every single Sunday morning at the most exclusive country club in the state of Georgia. They drank expensive scotch together and traded favors behind closed doors to protect their mutual interests. Preston believed that this deep-rooted network was an impenetrable fortress of power. I believed that no amount of financial evidence or corporate maneuvering could ever defeat the raw physical authority of the local police force. He listened to the phone ringing. A smug, nasty smile began to spread across his pale face. He watched me standing calmly next to my father, and he truly believed he was about to put me in my rightful place. He waited for the chief to answer, and when he heard the familiar gruff voice on the line, Preston immediately launched into a frantic, highly exaggerated performance of a terrified, innocent victim. Preston spoke rapidly into the phone, his voice echoing loudly across the tense and silent ballroom. He told the police chief that there was a massive emergency at the Ritz-Carlton downtown tonight now. He claimed that a group of highly aggressive armed individuals had violently crashed a private corporate gala. He deliberately described my father and his private security team as a hostile gang of thugs who were currently terrorizing the wealthy guests and threatening the lives of the Vanguard executives. He insisted that the situation was rapidly escalating and demanded that the chief send a tactical strike unit to the hotel immediately. He yelled into the phone, stating that these dangerous criminals were attempting to extort the Sterling family and were physically holding the board of directors hostage inside the grand ballroom. He played the role of the panicked wealthy citizen, perfectly using specific trigger words designed to ensure a massive and overwhelming police response. He hung up the phone and shoved it back into his jacket pocket. The desperate fear that had consumed him just a few minutes ago was entirely gone now. He rolled his shoulders back and puffed out his chest, looking at me with an expression of absolute, unadulterated triumph. I took a few slow, confident steps toward the center of the room, making sure every single guest was watching his glorious counterattack unfold before their amazed eyes. I was completely convinced that he had just secured his ultimate victory over us. He pointed his finger directly at my face and let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded incredibly harsh in the quiet room. He told me that my little theatrical performance was officially over. He boasted that I had made a catastrophic miscalculation by bringing my father into this building. He sneered and declared that the justice system in this city works exclusively for people who look like him, and not for people who look like my father. He proudly announced that the law was his. He said the law was a weapon his family had wielded for generations, and he had just aimed it directly at my head. He told me that all my brilliant financial strategies and all my secret offshore investigations meant absolutely nothing when faced with the raw power of the state. He walked a little closer, his eyes shining with malicious glee. He predicted exactly what was going to happen next. He said the police were going to burst through those shattered oak doors with their weapons drawn. He promised that they were going to throw my father onto the floor. He bragged that they would put him in heavy steel handcuffs. He stated that I was going to be publicly marched out of the luxury hotel in front of all these elite guests, completely humiliated and stripped of all my sudden power. He told me I was going to spend the rest of my miserable life rotting in a tiny concrete cell for daring to attack his prestigious family. Preston turned his attention to my father, looking him up and down with deep, obvious disgust. He told my father that his sudden billionaire status was clearly an elaborate fraudulent scam. He laughed and said that a black man walking into a high society event claiming to own the entire company was a pathetic joke that the police would easily expose. He assured the terrified board of directors that they had absolutely nothing to worry about. He promised the wealthy executives that his law firm would personally ensure that my father was prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law for corporate espionage and criminal extortion. He told the crowd that the natural order of things was about to be swiftly restored. Chloe, who was still crying silently, looked up slowly. She looked at her husband with a glimmer of desperate hope in her eyes. Despite the fact that she had just discovered his horrible betrayal with Jasmine, she still desperately wanted to believe that his white privilege could save their family from total financial ruin. Beatrice also stopped her pathetic sobbing on the floor. The disgraced matriarch wiped her ruined makeup and looked toward the entrance, praying for the police to arrive and rescue her dynasty. They all clung to Preston's arrogant promises because it was the only lifeline they had left. I stood perfectly still and simply watched him. I watched Preston bask in his own manufactured glory. I did not say a single word. I did not try to argue with his racist assumptions or correct his deeply flawed understanding of how real power actually operates. I just waited patiently for reality to come crashing through the doors once again. Less than 5 minutes later, the distinct piercing wail of multiple police sirens echoed from the busy downtown streets outside the hotel. The flashing red and blue lights, reflected brightly against the tall glass windows of the grand ballroom, casting strange spinning shadows across the crystal chandeliers tonight. The sound of heavy combat boots hitting the marble floors of the lobby grew louder and louder. Preston smiled a massive triumphant grin, He turned toward the entrance, rubbing his hands together in eager anticipation. He was ready to watch me lose everything. A tactical police unit poured into the room, moving with swift, coordinated precision. A dozen officers wearing heavy protective gear and carrying secured weapons fanned out across the edges of the massive space. The wealthy guests gasped and moved nervously out of the way, pressing themselves against the silk-draped tables. The atmosphere shifted to physical fear. Finally, the local police chief stepped through the shattered oak doors. He was a tall, imposing man with graying hair and a stern, weathered face. He wore a crisp, dark uniform, decorated with numerous shiny brass medals. He surveyed the chaotic scene in the ballroom, his sharp eyes scanning the trembling crowd. Preston immediately rushed toward his golfing buddy, waving his arms frantically to get his attention. He pointed his finger directly at my father and me, yelling at the top of his lungs. He told the chief that we were the hostile intruders who were terrorizing the Vanguard executives. I demanded that the officers arrest us immediately and charge us with federal extortion and armed trespassing. He told the chief to put us in handcuffs right now and drag us out of the building. He stood there expecting his personal friend to instantly obey his frantic commands and execute his ruthless revenge. The police chief stopped walking. He looked at Preston for a very long, quiet moment. His expression was completely unreadable. He did not issue a single order to his tactical officers. I did not reach for his heavy steel handcuffs. He simply stared at the arrogant lawyer. He stared at the white lawyer who thought he owned the entire city. Then the chief slowly turned his head and looked directly at my father. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for the inevitable violent confrontation. But the confrontation never happened. The police chief bypassed Preston completely. He walked right past the demanding lawyer, completely ignoring his loud, frantic instructions. He strode confidently up to the front of the room where my father was standing calmly with his hands clasped behind his back. The chief stopped directly in front of my father and did something incredibly surprising today. The powerful police chief extended his right hand and shook my father's hand with a firm, deep, and incredibly warm respect. He nodded his head slightly, acknowledging my father not as a criminal suspect, but as a highly valued and deeply respected ally. Preston let out a loud, strangled gasp of absolute confusion. He could not process what he was seeing. He stammered, asking the chief what he was doing and demanding to know why my father was not being tackled to the marble floor. The chief slowly turned back to face Preston. He reached into his crisp uniform jacket. He pulled out two thick folded pieces of heavy legal paper. He held them up so the entire room could see them clearly. He told Preston that there was indeed a massive criminal emergency taking place tonight, but it had absolutely nothing to do with armed intruders. He explained that 3 hours ago, my father had personally visited the police headquarters and met directly with the federal authorities. He told the silent ballroom that my father had handed over a massive, irrefutable dossier containing hundreds of pages of digital evidence, proving extensive federal wire fraud and severe corporate embezzlement today. The chief unfolded the thick papers, revealing the bright red seals of a federal judge. He looked Preston directly in the eye and stated that these were immediate arrest warrants. He announced clearly that the warrants were for Preston and Darius. He explained that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was currently waiting outside in the parking lot to transport them directly to a federal holding facility. Preston completely collapsed, falling to his knees as the tactical officers moved in to place him under arrest. The ultimate white privilege he had relied upon his entire life had just utterly failed him. Preston collapsed onto the cold marble floor as the tactical police officers surrounded him completely. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly around his wrists, sealing his miserable fate. He sobbed uncontrollably, his arrogant white privilege utterly shattered by the undeniable reality of federal wire fraud. Chloe screamed and backed away from her disgraced husband, refusing to look at him as the officers hauled him up to his feet. The entire ballroom watched in absolute silence as the century-old legal dynasty was permanently destroyed in front of their very eyes. Darius stood perfectly still on the stage, breathing very heavily. His chest heaved rapidly as he watched his brother-in-law being marched toward the exit. He knew with absolute certainty that he was next in line. The federal arrest warrants my father handed to the police chief were not just for Preston alone. They were for him too. The horrifying realization that he was about to spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary hit him like a massive physical blow. He looked at the police chief, who was now turning his stern gaze toward the stage. Darius felt a deep primal animal instinct completely take over. He knew he simply could not escape the building tonight. The private security guards and the tactical police unit completely blocked every single exit in the grand ballroom. He was entirely trapped with absolutely nowhere to run. But Darius was a man driven by sheer spite and overwhelming greed. If he was going down, he was absolutely determined to drag the entire corporate empire down with him. He refused to let my father and me take control of the vast wealth Vanguard Holdings possessed. He lunged toward the grand wooden podium, his shaking hands grabbing his sleek black executive laptop. He flipped the screen open and frantically typed in his secure master password. His dark eyes were wide with a manic, desperate energy. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated malice. He yelled across the silent ballroom that if he could not have the company, nobody would ever have the company. He declared that he was going to quickly drain every single drop of liquid capital from the corporate accounts before the police could even reach the stage. He hammered his fingers hard against the keyboard, his face pale and dripping with heavy beads of cold sweat. He shouted loudly that Vanguard Holdings had over $500 million in untraceable liquid assets sitting in temporary holding accounts for the upcoming quarter. He boasted that he was the only person in the entire building who possessed the ultimate master keys to the kingdom treasury. He loudly mocked me as he navigated through the complex banking interfaces. He told the terrified board of directors that he was currently authorizing a massive irreversible wire transfer. He claimed he was sending the entire $500 million sum to a series of encrypted offshore accounts located in highly secure, untouchable jurisdictions. He stated those foreign banks did not have extradition treaties with the federal government. He laughed a hysterical, broken laugh and told me that I might own the company on paper, but I was about to inherit an empty, worthless shell. He sneered at me and told me that I was always incredibly foolish when it came to the technical infrastructure of the corporate world. He said I might understand spreadsheets and financial projections, but I severely lacked the sophisticated technical access required to actually control the digital money. He proudly bragged that he had spent many millions of dollars. He claimed he upgraded the corporate security systems to ensure that no one could ever override his executive commands. He told the silent crowd that he was a visionary leader who always planned for the worst possible scenarios. He loudly yelled that he was taking his massive fortune with him and leaving us all to choke on the ashes of his ruined legacy. The police officers began moving toward the stage, their heavy boots thudding against the floor, but Darius did not care at all. He really only needed a few more seconds to execute the final devastating wire transfer. He looked at the loading bar on his laptop screen, his eyes burning with triumphant, vindictive joy. He truly believed he had finally found the perfect escape hatch. He thought he could buy his way out of federal prison using the very money he was stealing from my father's company. He typed out the final authorization code and slammed his right hand down on the enter key with a loud, definitive smack. He looked up at me, expecting to see absolute terror on my face. He expected me to scream and beg him to stop the massive financial transfer tonight. He wanted me to fall to my knees and plead for the financial survival of the empire I had just claimed. He waited for the triumphant confirmation ping from the banking server, but the confirmation ping never arrived. Instead, a harsh, blaring alarm erupted from the laptop speakers. The bright screen abruptly shifted from a calm corporate blue to a violent, aggressive red. A massive warning message flashed across the display in bold black letters. The words "access denied" blinked rapidly, illuminating his sweating face with a sinister crimson glow. Darius stared directly at the glowing screen in total disbelief. He hammered the enter key again and again, his panic returning with tenfold intensity. He shouted that the computer system was completely malfunctioning. He cursed at the machine and tried to type his master password one more time. The screen flashed red again, emitting another loud, obnoxious error tone. The words "access denied" remained stubbornly fixed on the bright display. Darius looked like a man who had just watched his last lifeboat sink into the dark ocean. He could not comprehend what was happening. He possessed the highest level of security clearance in the entire organization. He was the boss. How was the chief executive officer? He had the master keys. It was technically impossible for the system to lock him out of the primary accounts. He looked around wildly, screaming for his technical support team, demanding that someone fix the glitch immediately. No one moved to help him. The tactical police officers slowed their approach, watching the pathetic display unfold. I slowly walked toward the stage, my emerald gown gliding smoothly over the marble floor. I did not rush. I took my sweet time, letting the unbearable weight of his massive failure crush him completely. I climbed slowly up. I climbed the short steps onto the stage and walked directly over to the podium. Darius backed away from me, his eyes wide with sheer terror. He looked at me as if I were a ghost rising from the grave. I stopped right in front of the open laptop. The violent red light bathed my face in a soft crimson hue. I looked down at the flashing error message and smiled. I reached out and calmly shut the laptop lid, closing off the blaring alarm and plunging the stage back into normal light. I looked directly into his panicked eyes. I told him that the system was not malfunctioning at all. I explained that the banking servers were operating exactly as they were designed to operate. I told him that his master keys were entirely useless because the lock had been changed. Darius vigorously shook his head, stammering aloud that it was impossible. He yelled that he personally hired a top-tier cybersecurity firm 4 years ago to build the ultimate biometric financial firewall for Vanguard Holdings. He boasted that it was the most impenetrable digital fortress in the entire real estate industry. I simply nodded slowly, acknowledging his statement. I told him that he was absolutely right about the security system. I agreed that the biometric firewall was indeed an impenetrable masterpiece of modern technology. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile and told him that I knew exactly how perfect it was because I was the one who personally designed it. I carefully watched the blood drain completely from his face as I revealed my final technical secret. I explained that the elite cybersecurity firm he hired 4 years ago was just another anonymous proxy firm that I completely controlled. I told him that I spent 6 months meticulously coding the core architecture of the Vanguard financial network while he was busy playing golf with his arrogant friends. I clearly explained that I built a highly classified backdoor into the master mainframe that only responded to my specific digital signature. I told Darius that I had never lacked technical access. I simply allowed him to believe he held the keys because it kept his massive ego satisfied. I explained that the exact second my gold pen touched the divorce papers at our dinner table, my automated dead man switch was permanently activated by me. I told him that the system instantly recognized the legal severance of our marriage and immediately revoked every single ounce of his executive authority. I explained that I locked him out of the corporate treasury before he even finished his ridiculous speech about finding a new queen. I leaned in very close to his deeply terrified face. I told him that his accounts were frozen, his access was permanently denied, and his entire net worth was effectively zero. I stepped back and let the police officers move in to grab his arms. I told him he was now utterly penniless. I watched as the heavy tactical gear of the officers brushed past my silk gown. They grabbed Darius by his shoulders and spun him around roughly. He did not even try to fight them. All the fight had completely drained out of his body the moment the laptop screen flashed red. The cold steel handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a sharp metallic clack that echoed perfectly through the quiet ballroom. He looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes filled with a hollow, devastating emptiness. He finally realized the true magnitude of his spectacular and complete personal failure. I had spent 10 years believing he was the undisputed king of a massive empire, while I was nothing but a silent shadow in his background. He never realized that the shadow was actually the one holding the entire structure together. He thought he could steal $500 million right in front of my face and run away to a tropical paradise with his mistress. He thought his basic administrative passwords could defeat the complex digital labyrinth I constructed with my own 2 hands. I was really nothing but a very foolish, arrogant man playing in a massive universe. I was playing in a universe he could never possibly comprehend. The tactical police officers began to march him toward the edge of the stage. The wealthy executives sitting at the front tables watched him go with absolute disgust. They saw a man who tried to steal their investments and destroy their livelihoods just to save his own miserable skin. Darius looked down at the floor, completely unable to meet the eyes of the people he had tried to betray. He was now officially stripped of his title, his wealth, his dignity, and his freedom, all in one single night. I stood very tall on the stage and watched the tactical officers lead my former husband down the marble steps. The empire he tried to steal was now completely secure and locked safely behind my flawless digital walls. The corporate treasury was fully protected, and the company was ready to thrive under genuine, competent leadership. I looked out at the massive crowd of elite guests and allowed myself a moment of pure, quiet satisfaction. The biometric financial firewall had done its job perfectly. Darius was walking out the heavy doors as a broke, convicted felon with absolutely nothing left forever. The heavy tactical boots of the police officers echoed across the marble floor as they continued to march my disgraced husband and his criminal brother-in-law toward the shattered oak doors. I stood on the stage and watched the terrifying reality of the situation completely crush whatever was left of the Sterling family matriarch. Beatrice had spent the entire evening trying to maintain her desperate illusion of absolute control, but watching her precious son being hauled away in cold steel, handcuffs finally broke her entirely. Her elitist facade simply dissolved right in front of the 200 wealthy guests she had spent her entire life trying to impress. She was no longer the untouchable queen of Atlanta high society. She was just a terrified elderly woman facing the sudden violent destruction of her entire universe. She looked at the police officers, and then she looked up at me, standing next to my powerful father. She realized that I was the only person in the entire building who possessed the authority to stop this catastrophic nightmare. Her pride completely vanished, replaced by a pathetic, desperate need to survive the night. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, her expensive designer gown dragging across the floor. Beatrice crawled directly toward the edge of the stage, moving with a frantic, pathetic energy. This display made several of the elite guests look away in pure disgust. She reached out with her trembling, manicured hands and desperately grasped the hem of my emerald silk gown. She looked up at me with tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Her voice cracked as she began to wail loudly, begging me for a mercy she absolutely never deserved. She cried out that we were family and I could not do this today. She pleaded with me to remember the 10 years we spent living under the same roof. She screamed that I was destroying a legacy of black excellence and tearing apart a prominent family that had worked so hard to build a corporate empire. She begged me to call off the federal authorities and tell the police chief that this was all just a massive, terrible misunderstanding. She sobbed and swore that she would do anything I wanted if I just gave her son another chance. She promised to publicly welcome me back into the family and treat me respectfully forever. I looked down at the weeping woman clutching my dress and felt absolutely nothing but cold, clinical indifference. I slowly stepped back, pulling the delicate silk fabric out of her desperate, grasping fingers. I did not want her toxic hands touching me ever again. I looked into her tear-filled eyes and softly asked her if she really wanted to talk about our family history. I asked her if she remembered the very first Thanksgiving I spent at the Buckhead estate 9 years ago. I reminded her how I spent 3 entire days cooking a massive, beautiful, delicious dinner alone. I had worked hard to impress her and her arrogant friends. I told the silent ballroom how Beatrice walked into the kitchen, looked at the food I had painstakingly prepared, and ordered her staff to throw every single dish directly into the garbage. I reminded her how she coldly stated that my cheap working-class cooking was entirely unfit for her elegant dining table. I told her she forced me to sit in the kitchen and watch the catering staff serve her guests, while I ate cold leftover bread. I asked her if that was the loving family dynamic today. I asked if she was currently begging me to protect that dynamic. Beatrice shook her head wildly, saying that she was just trying to teach me the proper standards of elite society. I ignored her pathetic excuses and continued to speak, my voice carrying effortlessly across the quiet room. I asked her if she remembered the conversation she had with Darius in the study 3 years ago, when I first brought up the idea of having children. I told the wealthy audience how I stood silently in the hallway and listened to my mother-in-law deeply insult me daily. She told my husband that my genetics were entirely inferior. I reminded her how she sneered and said that my common bloodline would permanently taint their glorious family tree. I told her she advised Darius to freeze his assets and find a woman with a proper political pedigree before he even thought about producing an heir. I looked at Jasmine, who was still cowering near the stairs, and told Beatrice that her desperate search for a superior bloodline had ultimately led her straight into a massive, federal criminal conspiracy. I asked Beatrice how she could possibly dare to speak today. I asked her how she could invoke the concept of black excellence when her entire life was built on tearing other black women down. Beatrice sobbed louder, covering her face with her hands as her darkest, most shameful secrets were broadcast to the entire city elite. I did not raise my voice, but I made sure every single syllable landed with maximum devastating impact. I delivered a chilling, perfectly calm monologue that meticulously dismantled every single lie Beatrice had ever told. I told the crowd that she was not a matriarch of excellence, but a petty, malicious tyrant always complaining. She ruled through financial manipulation and emotional abuse. I explained how she terrorized her own staff, bullied her neighbors, and constantly belittled anyone who did not drive the right car or wear the right designer labels. I stripped away her dignity piece by piece, exposing the rotten, decaying core of the Sterling family dynasty. I told the executives that the woman weeping on the floor had actively encouraged her son to discard me tonight, simply because she thought my father was a poor runaway. I smiled a cold, ruthless smile and told Beatrice that her profound, shallow judgment utterly failed. It had just cost her the entire corporate empire. I told her she traded a brilliant billionaire heiress for a broke, desperate criminal mistress, just to satisfy her own pathetic snobbery. Beatrice collapsed completely, lying flat on the cold marble floor as her grand illusion was permanently erased. She realized that I had meticulously recorded every single insult and every single slight she had ever thrown at me over the last decade. She finally understood that my quiet submission was never a sign of weakness, but a calculated strategy to gather the necessary ammunition required to completely destroy her today. I looked down at the ruined woman and delivered my absolute final verdict. I told Beatrice that her precious superior bloodline had just bought her a one-way ticket to federal prison for her arrogant son. I explained that Darius was going to spend the next 2 decades sitting in a tiny concrete cell, wondering how he lost a $500 million company to the wife he thought was an idiot. I then leaned forward and delivered the consequence for her own actions. I reminded her about the $10 million margin loan I purchased from the bank previously today. I told her that the eviction notice for the Buckhead estate was already being processed by the local county sheriff's department and would be executed before the sun even started to rise tomorrow. I told Beatrice that she was not going to be moving into a smaller luxury condo or a nice apartment in the suburbs. I informed her that, because Darius had secretly used her personal retirement accounts to collateralize his other failing real estate ventures, she was now entirely bankrupt. I watched her eyes widen in fresh terror as I explained that her son had stolen absolutely everything. He stole from her just as easily as he had stolen from his own company. I told her that she was going to have to pack her bags tonight and move directly into a low-income housing project on the south side of the city. I smiled and told her she was finally going to experience the exact same working-class lifestyle she had spent her entire miserable life mocking and degrading. I told her she would have to learn how to cook her own meals on a cheap stove and ride the public bus because her luxury vehicles vanished. They were currently being repossessed by the bank. I told her that the high society friends she loved so much would never return her phone calls again, because poverty is considered a highly contagious disease in their elite circles today. Beatrice let out a loud, agonizing scream that echoed through the grand ballroom. It was the sound of a woman whose entire soul had just been crushed into fine dust. She tried to reach out for me again, begging me to let her keep just a fraction of her former wealth. She promised to be my servant always starting tonight. She offered to clean my new penthouse if I would just let her stay in the guest house of the Buckhead estate. I stepped back again, looking at her with absolute disgust. I told her that I did not employ people who threw food in the garbage, and I certainly did not employ women who thought my genetics were inferior. I looked past her weeping form and signaled to the tactical police officers who were standing near the shattered oak doors. I commanded the police to take them all away. I told the chief of police to clear everyone rapidly. I told him to clear the trash out of my brand new ballroom so my father and I could properly celebrate our massive financial victory. The police officers immediately stepped forward, their heavy boots clicking aggressively against the polished marble floor as they moved to execute my absolute final commands tonight. Two officers grabbed Beatrice by her arms and hauled her roughly to her feet. She kicked and screamed, thrashing wildly against their firm grip. She yelled my name, cursing me and calling me a monster as they dragged her away from the stage. I stood perfectly still, observing always. I watched her humiliating exit with a calm, satisfied expression. She had demanded that security throw me out of the building just an hour ago, and now she was the one being forcibly removed by the armed authorities. Chloe ran after her mother, sobbing hysterically and begging the officers to be gentle, but she was quickly pushed back by another guard. The remaining Vanguard executives watched the complete eradication of the Sterling family with wide, terrified eyes. They had witnessed a masterclass in corporate and personal destruction. They knew that I was a ruthless leader who never tolerated blatant disrespect. I would never tolerate betrayal in any form. My father walked up beside me and placed a proud hand on my shoulder. We watched the heavy oak doors finally swing shut behind the disgraced matriarch and her criminal family. The room was finally cleansed of their toxic, arrogant presence, leaving behind a fresh, clean slate. I turned to face the silent crowd of wealthy politicians and powerful real estate moguls. The chaotic noise of the police sirens outside slowly faded into the distance, taking the last remnants of my painful past along with it. I looked at the corporate board. They were still bowing their heads in deep submission. I told them that the era of arrogance and incompetence was officially dead and buried. I informed them that Vanguard Holdings was now under the absolute control of a woman who actually knew how to build an empire from the ground up. I promised them that if they remained loyal and followed my precise directions, we would achieve profits that Darius could never even dream of comprehending. I picked up a fresh glass of expensive champagne, proposing a toast to the total destruction of the Sterling family forever and always tonight. Outside the shattered oak doors, Darius stumbled forward, his head hanging low as the officers pushed him through the grand lobby of the luxury hotel. Preston dragged his feet, weeping openly, as the illusion of his untouchable white privilege shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They were no longer powerful corporate titans commanding respect and demanding absolute submission from everyone around them. They were just two desperate felons being hauled away to face the severe federal consequences of their massive financial crimes forever. My father had meticulously planned every single detail of this beautiful destruction, including the magnificent media spectacle waiting right outside the building. Dozens of local news vans and aggressive financial reporters were completely blocking the main entrance of the hotel. The blinding white flashes of professional cameras illuminated the dark night sky as Darius and Preston were shoved through the revolving glass doors. The aggressive journalists shouted rapid-fire questions about the stolen pension funds and the sudden hostile corporate takeover. Darius tried to cover his weeping face with his shackled hands, but the bright camera flashes captured every single ounce of his profound public humiliation. The live news broadcasts beamed the pathetic images of the ruined Sterling family directly into every single wealthy living room across the entire state of Georgia. Their carefully manufactured reputation was being systematically eradicated on live television for the whole world to see tonight. Beatrice remained entirely paralyzed on the cold ballroom floor while she listened to the loud, chaotic media frenzy erupting outside the hotel. She realized that her precious dynasty was completely dead, and her glorious social standing was permanently erased from the high society registry. The remaining wealthy guests simply stepped around her weeping form as they quickly evacuated the ruined corporate gala. No one stopped to offer the disgraced matriarch a single word of comfort or a helping hand because poverty and scandal were highly contagious diseases in her elitist world. She was left entirely alone in the massive empty ballroom, surrounded by the scattered wreckage of her shattered illusions. I looked down at her one last time before turning my back on her pathetic existence completely. I walked out of the luxury hotel with my father, leaving the toxic remnants of the Sterling family rotting in the dark shadows. Exactly 1 year later, The brilliant sunshine illuminated my pristine world, while the criminals who tried to destroy me rotted in total darkness. The federal court system moved with incredible speed when presented with the undeniable forensic accounting evidence I meticulously gathered. Darius and Preston both received harsh 15-year sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. Their massive legal bills and the enormous court-ordered financial restitution had completely drained whatever hidden assets they managed to conceal. Beatrice was brutally evicted from the $10 million Buckhead estate the very next morning, just as I had explicitly promised her. The bank seized every single luxury vehicle and froze every single retirement account to cover the catastrophic debts her incompetent son created. The arrogant matriarch, who once measured human worth by designer labels, was violently thrown into a harsh, unforgiving reality she absolutely despised. Beatrice currently lives in a cramped, run-down one-bedroom apartment located in a notoriously dangerous neighborhood on the far south side. Her tiny, miserable living space constantly smells of cheap bleach and old cooking grease. She spends her miserable days clipping discount grocery coupons and riding the crowded public transit buses she used to viciously mock. The wealthy country club friends she once worshipped completely blocked her phone number and banned her from their exclusive gated communities. She occasionally sees my face on the covers of prestigious financial magazines while she stands in line at the local discount grocery store. The profound psychological torture of watching the woman she relentlessly bullied become the most powerful billionaire in the city is slowly driving her almost completely insane. She is permanently trapped in a miserable, impoverished cage of her own making, carrying the heavy, crushing guilt of her own profound, absolute failure. Jasmine faced an equally brutal and deeply satisfying downfall after her powerful political father publicly disowned her on the speakerphone that night. The state senator successfully buried the scandal to save his own career, but he completely severed all financial and personal ties with his greedy daughter. Jasmine was unceremoniously evicted from her luxury penthouse and blacklisted from every single elite political circle in the state. The pampered princess, who planned to steal $10 million, is now working a grueling minimum wage job as a late-night waitress at a cheap roadside diner. She spends her miserable shifts wiping down sticky laminate tables and serving greasy food to rude customers who treat her with zero respect. The glorious political marriage she orchestrated vanished into thin air, leaving her with nothing but sore feet and a profound, crushing regret that will haunt her for the rest of her pathetic life. I stood confidently in my magnificent glass-walled corner office, located on the 50th floor of the tallest skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. The panoramic view of the bustling city skyline stretched out before me, a beautiful sprawling kingdom that I now completely and officially controlled. The heavy gold lettering on the thick frosted glass door behind my massive mahogany desk proudly displayed my name as the undisputed chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings. I completely restructured the entire corporate hierarchy during my first 3 months in power, purging the incompetent executives who had blindly enabled my foolish ex-husband. I transformed the crumbling real estate firm into a massive, unstoppable global financial juggernaut that dominated the market. I no longer hid my brilliant analytical mind in the quiet shadows of a toxic marriage. I stepped boldly into the brilliant light, demanding and receiving absolute respect from every single industry leader. The toxic culture of arrogance and blatant elitism that once poisoned Vanguard Holdings was completely eradicated the second I took the helm. I implemented aggressive new investment strategies that prioritized sustainable community development and ruthless corporate efficiency over shallow status symbols. The board of directors who once bowed to Darius now answered exclusively to me, their loyalty secured by the massive, unprecedented profits I consistently delivered every single quarter. I worked incredibly long hours building my empire, but the exhaustion felt incredibly rewarding because every single victory belonged entirely to me. I never had to shrink myself down to protect a fragile male ego ever again. I wore my immense success like a perfectly tailored suit, commanding the boardroom with a cold, calculated precision that terrified my competitors. The quiet, submissive wife was permanently dead, and the legendary financial mastermind had fully resurrected the company from its absolute burning ashes. My father sat across from me in a plush leather chair, reviewing the final complex legal documents for our newest massive business venture. We were finalizing a massive $2 billion acquisition of a rival private equity firm that would solidify our absolute dominance in the southeastern financial sector. Elijah looked up from the thick stack of papers and offered me a warm, deeply proud smile that filled my heart with genuine joy. We had spent the last 12 months building a beautiful, unbreakable bond that completely erased the pain of our forced 10-year separation. We were not just a father and a daughter anymore. We were a lethal, unstoppable corporate partnership that ruthlessly conquered every single obstacle in our path. I smiled back at him, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace and absolute power resonating through every single fiber of my being in this very moment. My private, secure smartphone suddenly buzzed against the polished mahogany surface of my massive desk, shattering the quiet, comfortable silence of the office. I slowly picked up the device and looked directly at the bright, glowing screen. The caller identification system displayed an automated warning indicating an incoming collect call from a high-security federal penitentiary. The name, Darius, flashed across the smooth glass surface, like a pathetic ghost reaching out from a very dark, miserable grave. He was likely calling to beg for expensive legal representation or to plead for a tiny sliver of unearned mercy. I stared at his name for a long, quiet moment, feeling absolutely devoid of any lingering anger or triumphant gloating. I simply pressed the red decline button and permanently blocked the number forever. I raised a crystal glass of cold, expensive champagne toward my father, sealing my ultimate revenge in absolute total silence. The story of Savannah teaches us a powerful lesson about the danger of arrogance and the hidden strength of silence. For 10 years, her husband's family treated her like a worthless outsider, blinded by their own privilege and obsession with social status. They mistook her patience for weakness and her quiet compliance for ignorance. However, true power rarely needs to announce itself. While they wasted their time boasting and seeking external validation, Savannah meticulously built an empire in the shadows. She teaches us that you should never underestimate someone just because they do not match your superficial definition of success. Arrogance creates massive blind spots, leading people to hand the keys of their destruction to the very individuals they oppress. Furthermore, the story proves that the ultimate revenge is not loud or violent. It is absolute, calculated preparation. By the time her enemies realized they were in a trap, the doors were already locked. Savannah's journey reminds us to silently secure our own independence, know our undeniable worth, and let our flawless execution speak for itself when the time is absolutely right. If this story inspired you to claim your own power, please subscribe and share your thoughts down below.